She has not spoken to him in 143 days, and yet, watching a stranger's mouth graze her glove, the Duke of Ravensmere feels, for the first time in his marriage, something close to panic. The ballroom of Ashworth House is at its brightest hour. It is nearly midnight, and the candles in the great chandeliers have burned long enough that the wax has begun to run in slow, pale ribbons down the crystal arms, catching the light, so that the whole room seems to glitter with something soft and half-melted. Somewhere beneath the music, glasses are being refilled faster than they are being emptied. This is the London season, at its most crowded and its most watchful, and everyone in this room has learned, long before tonight, exactly how to look as though they are not watching at all. Lady Dorothea Carrington, the Duchess of Ravensmere, though she still sometimes forgets to answer to the title when it is spoken quickly, stands near a marble pillar in a gown the color of storm clouds. Her gloved hand is extended toward an elderly gentleman, silver-haired, his coat a decade out of fashion in the way that only a man who has spent years abroad can manage without embarrassment. He bows over her hand. He presses his lips to her knuckles, the way a man greets a goddaughter he has known since her christening, not the way a man greets a woman he intends to steal. Dorothea does not know she is being watched. She only knows that her hand feels warm inside its glove for the first time in longer than she can say, and that the warmth has nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with the fact that this is the first face in this entire glittering room that has looked at her the way a person looks at someone they are glad, simply glad, to see again. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being looked at constantly and truly seen by no one, and Dorothea has been carrying it for months now, the way a person carries a stone in a pocket long enough to stop noticing its weight. Tonight, for just this small handful of seconds, the stone has gone quiet. She smiles at her godfather in a way she has not smiled at anyone in this city since her wedding, not the careful, calibrated smile she has learned to wear for drawing rooms, but something looser, something that reaches all the way to her eyes before she remembers to guard it. She does not see her husband across the room. She has trained herself, out of necessity more than habit, not to look for him in crowded spaces, because looking for him and finding nothing in his expression had, in the early months of her marriage, cost her more than she could afford to keep losing. So she does not know that his glass has gone still in his hand, or that a muscle along his jaw has tightened in a way none of his oldest friends have seen in years, or that somewhere behind his composed and famously unreadable face, something is beginning, very quietly, to crack. Across the room, near the tall windows, Jasper Montrose, the Duke of Ravensmere, 31 years old, a man who has never in his adult life allowed his composure to slip in public, freezes with his glass of claret, arrested halfway to his mouth. He does not set the glass down. He does not lift it either. He simply stands there, watching a stranger's mouth touch his wife's glove, and feels the floor of his own certainty give way beneath him, one board at a time. He has spent 143 days believing he knew exactly what kind of woman he had married. Tonight, watching her hand rest so easily inside another man's, he understands, for one terrible silent moment, that he does not know her at all. And worse, that he has never once given himself the chance to find out. We'll leave her hand in his a moment longer, and the Duke's jaw a little tighter, because you deserve to know exactly how a man who once forbade his wife to speak to him ends up watching another man kiss her glove, and what it costs him. If you're the kind of listener who likes to sit with a story until the very last word, I'd love it if you'd subscribe now and let me keep you company through this one. And if you don't, well, you owe me a favor by the time we're through, and I intend to collect it. Now let me take you back to where this began, not to the ballroom, not even to the marriage. Let me take you back to a wedding day that started in silence, and a command no bride should ever have to hear. 6 months earlier, Dorothea Carrington had been a vicar's daughter with a dead father, a mounting stack of unpaid accounts, and a younger sister whose entire future depended on her willingness to marry a man she had met exactly twice. She had not been raised to expect a fairy tale. She had been raised to expect duty, and she had learned, in the space of a single terrible autumn, that duty could ask a very great deal more of a person than anyone had ever warned her. I want you to picture her exactly as she was then, before any of this began, because the woman standing in that ballroom tonight was built entirely out of what happened to the girl I am about to describe to you. She was 23. She had her father's steady hands and her mother's quiet stubbornness, and she had spent the whole of her short life believing, without ever quite examining the belief, that the people who loved you would tell you the truth eventually, if you were only patient enough to wait for it. She was about to learn, in the space of 11 very long days, exactly how wrong that belief could be. This is where her story truly begins, not in a ballroom glittering with candlelight, but in a small country study with the smell of old paper and older grief, the first place she learned that the people meant to protect you can also, without ever raising their voice, be the ones who leave you the most alone. Reverend Carrington had been dead 11 days when Dorothea found the first ledger. It was tucked behind a row of sermon books in his study, the leather cover softened with handling, and she had only opened it because she was looking for the household accounts, which the family solicitor had asked her to produce before Thursday. What she found instead was a record of debts stretching back 9 years, small loans against the harvest, then larger ones, then loans taken to pay the interest on other loans, each entry in her father's careful, familiar hand, each one a small lie he had told his family by omission, Sunday after Sunday, for nearly a decade. She sat at his desk for a long time that morning. The window behind her father's chair looked out over the churchyard, and she could see, from where she sat, the fresh, dark rectangle of earth where he had been buried not 2 weeks before, the flowers already wilting on top of it because no one had thought to bring fresh ones since the funeral. She did not cry. She had already learned in those first 11 days of widowhood, her mother having died years before, when Dorothea was still a girl, that there was no one left whose comfort she could afford to need. So instead of crying, she did what she had always done when a thing was too large to feel all at once. She reached for a pen, and she began, very slowly, to make a plan. She worked through the night, by a single candle that burned down to almost nothing before she finished, listing every debt against every possible remedy, crossing out one solution after another as impossible until only a single line remained on the page, written in her own careful hand, a marriage, arranged quickly, to someone whose fortune could absorb what her father's could not. She looked at that sentence for a long time before she allowed herself to accept it. Then she blew out the candle, and she did not let herself reconsider it again. The plan, in the end, had a name: Jasper Montrose, Duke of Ravensmere. A distant cousin of her mother's, a woman with more ambition than tact, had heard that the Duke, vastly wealthy, famously private, in want of an heir, and entirely uninterested in the marriage mart that every other duke in England seemed to enjoy, might be persuaded to consider a match that solved a problem quietly and without fuss. Dorothea had met him exactly twice before the wedding. Both times, he had been perfectly correct, perfectly courteous, and entirely unreadable. She told herself this was enough. She told herself that a man who was correct and courteous might, in time, become a man who was also kind. She had been raised on vicarage economics, where you did not wait for the ideal outcome. You worked with what arrived on your doorstep, and you made it serve. What she wanted, though she would have been ashamed to say it aloud even to her sister, was smaller and larger than security. She wanted, after a lifetime of being managed and arranged and quietly disposed of by people who loved her in their fashion but never quite saw her, to be known, to matter to someone not because she was useful, but simply because she was Dorothea. She feared, though she would not have admitted this either, that she was not the sort of woman anyone chose for her own sake. Her father had loved her, she believed, but he had also left her a decade of secret debt, and never once trusted her enough to tell her the truth while he lived. Well, if the man who raised her could not bring himself to be honest with her, what hope did she have that a stranger, bought and paid for through a solicitor's letter, ever would? She had, at least, her own quiet certainty of self. She would not perform her grief for an audience. She would not beg to be loved, and she would not abandon her own sense of what was right simply because someone with more power than her demanded it. It was, in the end, the only dowry she brought to Ravensmere Hall that could not be counted or seized, a spine that did not bend, even when everything around it did. Her younger sister Marianne had wept the morning Dorothea told her of the arrangement, not from sorrow, but from a guilt she could not fully articulate, the sense that her own future was being purchased at a price her sister would be the one to pay in full, quietly, for years to come. Dorothea had held her sister's face in both hands that morning and told her, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, that this was not a sacrifice. It was simply what sisters did for one another, and she would hear no more argument on the subject. It was the last conversation of its kind either of them would have for many months, because Dorothea left for Hampshire within the fortnight, and letters, once she arrived at Ravensmere Hall, would prove far harder to send freely than either of them had imagined. The wedding took place on a gray morning in a chapel too large for the handful of guests who attended. Dorothea wore her mother's gown, taken in at the waist by a maid who had never done such fine work before, and cried twice while doing it, apologizing each time, as though her tears were an imposition Dorothea could not afford. Jasper Montrose said his vows in a voice so even it might have been reading a legal document. Dorothea said hers, and meant every word, because that was the kind of woman she was. Even a bargain, once made, she intended to honor completely. She remembers, even now, the particular cold of the chapel stone beneath her thin slippers, and the way her new husband's hand had felt closing over hers at the altar. Not unkind, exactly, but careful in a way that told her nothing at all about what lay beneath the care. She had told herself, standing there, that carefulness was simply a kind of shyness in a man unused to company, and that shyness could, with patience, be coaxed toward something warmer. She did not yet know the man she had married had come to that altar, already convinced of her guilt. 3 weeks before the wedding, a packet of letters had arrived at Ravensmere Hall, unsigned, delivered by a hand no one could later trace, addressed simply to the Duke. Inside were copies of correspondence, supposedly written by Dorothea to her own father, describing the match in terms so mercenary, so coldly calculating, that any man reading them would have felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. She had written, the letters claimed, that the Duke was a fool, easily led by a modest face and a well-timed silence, that she intended to secure her sister's fortune and her family's name, and cared nothing at all for the man attached to the title. The letters were forgeries. Every word of them had been invented by a clerk with a talent for mimicking hands, working at the instruction of Jasper's own cousin, Mr. Edmund Vale, a man who stood to inherit the dukedom himself, should Jasper's marriage fail to produce an heir, and who understood, with the precision of a surgeon, exactly which wound in his cousin's chest to press. Because Jasper Montrose had been 9 years old when his own mother left his father for a wealthier man, and had learned, at an age when most boys are learning to ride, that a woman's affection could be purchased away by anyone willing to pay a higher price. He had built his entire adult life around the certainty that this lesson would never again be permitted to surprise him. The forged letters did not create his suspicion of women and rank and money. They simply confirmed, with what looked like documentary proof, a fear he had been carrying since boyhood, and confirmation, to a wounded man, is so much easier to accept than doubt. He remembered, the night the letters arrived, standing at his own study window for over an hour, without lighting a single candle, watching the dark fall over the park below, and feeling something in his chest settle into a shape he recognized from boyhood, the particular stillness of a person who has just been proven right about something they very much wished had been a lie. His mother had gone the same way, once. A carriage in the drive before dawn, a note left on the breakfast table instead of a goodbye, and a 9-year-old boy told by a governess, gently and much too late, that his mother had found a wealthier man and would not be returning. He had promised himself, somewhere in the years that followed, that he would never again be the boy standing at a window learning the truth from someone else's carefully chosen words. And yet here he was, a grown man of 31, doing exactly that. He told no one about the letters, not his solicitor, not his aunt, not a single soul in the vast household that answered to him. He locked them in the bottom drawer of his study desk, and on nights when sleep would not come, he took them out and read them again, as though rereading a wound enough times might eventually make it stop hurting. It never did. It only made the hurt more familiar, which he had come, by the time of his wedding, to mistake for healing. He arrived at his own wedding breakfast already a man convinced, and it was there, at the head of the long table at Ravensmere Hall, with the household staff arranged along the walls, and his aunt Lady Fenwick seated at his right hand, that Dorothea Carrington first understood exactly what kind of marriage she had made. The wedding breakfast at Ravensmere Hall was, by every outward measure, a beautiful affair. The long table had been dressed with hothouse flowers, forced early for the occasion, and the good silver, brought out only twice a year, caught the morning light in a way that made the whole room look, to anyone glancing in from the corridor, like a scene from a life worth envying. Dorothea sat at Jasper's left hand in her mother's gown, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, the way she had been taught to sit since she was a girl of 6. She had eaten almost nothing. She told herself this was nerves, ordinary bridal nerves, the kind every new wife must feel on the first morning of a marriage still unfamiliar to her. She did not yet know to feel anything else. Edmund Vale sat at the far end of the table, near enough to see everything, and far enough to seem uninvolved, a man with the particular gift of looking bored in rooms where he has arranged for something terrible to happen. He watched his cousin with the patience of someone who has already placed his wager and is simply waiting, now, to collect. It was Jasper who noticed first, though he would not have called it noticing, not then, that Dorothea did not tremble. Most young women in her position, marrying so far above the modest weight of their own name, would have trembled at least once during that long meal. She did not. She sat with a stillness that unsettled him slightly, though he could not have said why, and he filed the observation away without examining it, the way a man files away a detail he intends to use later and does not yet understand. What she noticed, in that same hour, was harder to name and cost her a great deal more. Beneath the composed surface of her new husband's face, in the half-second before he caught himself, she saw exhaustion, real, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that lives behind a person's eyes long after their expression has been arranged into something more presentable. It was there, and then it was gone, smoothed over so quickly that she nearly convinced herself she had imagined it. But she had not imagined it, and some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime learning to read the true weather beneath other people's calm faces, understood in that instant that she had not married a cold man. She had married a wounded one. And somehow, knowing this, she felt the last of her modest hope for an ordinary, even a kind arrangement quietly close its hand and let go. He rose to speak when the meal was nearly finished. The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when everyone in it already senses that something is about to happen, that they will discuss, in careful whispers, for weeks afterward. "You will not speak to me unless I address you first," he said, in a voice so level it might have been reading from a ledger. "Not at table, not in company, not in private. This is my wish, and you will honor it." No one moved. Somewhere down the table, a maid setting down a dish of preserves paused with the spoon still in the air. Lady Fenwick's mouth opened slightly and then closed again, as though she had thought better of whatever she meant to say. Edmund Vale did not smile, but something in the set of his shoulders eased, the way a man's shoulders ease when a plan he has been tending for months finally bears its first fruit. Dorothea rose from her chair. She did not weep, she did not argue, and she did not ask why, though the question sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending its ripples outward long after the surface had gone quiet again. She curtsied to her husband, a small, correct, perfectly executed curtsy, the kind she had been taught before she could properly read, and she said nothing at all, because he had just told her, in front of his entire household, that nothing was exactly what he wanted from her. It was her silence, more than any tears could have done, that unsettled Jasper Montrose down to the soles of his boots. He would not examine why for months, but something in him, some small, buried part that had not yet fully hardened, noted that a woman being punished does not usually stand quite so still. The weeks that followed took on a shape Dorothea had not expected and could not quite name. Jasper was often away in London on business he did not explain, and when he was at Ravensmere Hall, he kept to his study, his library, his own wing of the great house, as though the building itself had been divided by a line only he could see. Dorothea did not test the boundary. She had promised, at that altar, to honor her husband, and she intended to keep the promise, even when he made it nearly impossible to feel anything toward him but a slow, cold ache. She found, instead, a use for the hours he left empty. Each morning, before the household staff rose, she went down to the estate study and opened the ledgers, a habit carried over from her vicarage childhood, when she had helped her father balance the parish accounts, long before she understood what those numbers would one day cost her. She found errors almost immediately, small ones at first, a column added wrong, a rent recorded twice, the ordinary carelessness of an aging steward who had been managing the estate for longer than he should have without help. She corrected them quietly, in her own small hand, in the margins where no one thought to look. No one asked her to do this. No one, for many weeks, knew that she did. It was roughly 6 weeks into the marriage that Edmund Vale set his second scheme in motion. He had learned, through a lady's maid he paid handsomely and quietly, that an elderly gentleman had begun making regular visits to Ravensmere Hall during the Duke's absences, an old family friend of the new Duchess by all accounts, though Vale was far more interested in what the story could be made to sound like than in what it actually was. Within a fortnight, a rumor was moving through London drawing rooms, in the particular quiet way rumors travel among people who enjoy being the first to know something scandalous. The new Duchess of Ravensmere, it was whispered, entertained a gentleman caller whenever her husband was away. The gentleman in question was Sir Aldous Whitmore, Dorothea's own godfather, her late father's closest friend since their university days. A man who had once been ruined by a bad investment and saved, quietly, by a 15-year-old Dorothea who had convinced her own father to extend him credit no one else would offer. Sir Aldous had spent years abroad rebuilding what remained of his fortune, and he had returned to England only recently, seeking out the one family who had never once treated his misfortune as a reason for scorn. He came to see Dorothea because he loved her the way an uncle loves a favorite niece, and because he owed her a debt of gratitude he had waited a decade for the chance to repay. Dorothea told no one about the visits. She could not have explained why if asked directly, except that Jasper had forbidden her to speak to him at all, not at table, not in company, not in private. And she had taken the command, in her scrupulous, literal way, to mean that she was permitted to receive no one and explain nothing, that any word she offered in her own defense would itself be a kind of disobedience. The very silence her husband had imposed as punishment became, without either of them intending it, the exact mechanism by which she was about to be ruined. When the rumor reached Jasper in London, his first response was not fury. It was something quieter and, in its way, far worse. A kind of relief, cold and immediate. The relief of a man who has been braced for a blow and finally feels it land. Here, at last, was confirmation of everything the forged letters had always suggested. He did not ask himself why he found it so easy to believe the worst of a woman he had barely troubled to know. He only felt, in that moment, that the world had once again proven itself exactly as untrustworthy as he had always suspected, and there was a strange, terrible comfort in being right. Dorothea, meanwhile, faced a choice that grew heavier with every day she failed to make it. She could break her husband's command and speak in her own defense, risk further punishment, further silence, further proof to him that she was disobedient as well as suspect. Or she could continue enduring the quiet and watch the rumor calcify, day by day, into something the whole of London would soon accept as settled fact. It was during this same stretch of anxious mornings, bent over the ledgers before the household woke, that Dorothea made a discovery that would eventually unravel everything. She had begun cross-referencing the estate's income against its harvests and rents, a habit born partly of loneliness and partly of the same restless competence that had once balanced her father's parish books. And the numbers, when set side by side, did not agree. The estate's income had fallen steadily over 2 years, in a way that matched neither the harvest records nor the rent rolls. Money was leaving Ravensmere Hall through a channel no ledger accounted for. She said nothing to anyone. She had learned, by now, the cost of speaking before she understood exactly what she was looking at. But she began, in the quiet hours before dawn, to pull old correspondence Sir Aldous had once kept as the family's financial advisor years before, cross-referencing dates and figures with a patience that would have surprised anyone who still thought of her only as a quiet, dutiful bride. And it was during one of these early mornings, glancing up through the half-open door of her husband's study as she passed it in the gray hour before the staff rose, that she saw him, sitting alone at his desk, a single candle burned low, reading something worn soft with handling, his face arranged into an expression she recognized now, from that first wedding breakfast, as pain wearing the mask of calm. She did not know what the letter was. But she began, from that morning forward, to suspect that whatever her husband read alone in the dark, and the money quietly bleeding from his own estate, might be two threads of the very same knot, and that the coldness she had married might not have been a choice at all, but something done to him, long before she ever arrived to be blamed for it. The scandal, however, was not waiting for her suspicions to ripen. At a ball hosted by Lady Fenwick not 3 weeks later, Edmund Vale ensured that several of London's most reliable gossips overheard a fabricated account, richly detailed, of the Duchess's secret visitor. An account so specific, so convincingly embarrassed on the teller's behalf, that by midnight it had traveled the length of the ballroom and out into the street with the departing carriages. Jasper was there. He heard the whispers as they reached him, second-hand, the way a man always hears the worst things about himself last. And when Dorothea, across the room, felt every eye in that glittering space turn toward her at once, she looked to her own husband for some sign, a word, a gesture, anything that might tell the room he did not believe what it believed. He said nothing at all. His silence, in that moment, was read by every person present as confirmation, and it devastated Dorothea far more completely than any accusation could have, because an accusation at least required someone to look her in the eye. Lady Fenwick, believing the worst, cornered Dorothea in a quiet alcove before the night was through and made her position plain. Should the scandal touch the family name any further, she would see to it personally that the match currently being arranged for Dorothea's younger sister was quietly withdrawn. It was not a threat delivered in anger. It was delivered the way such threats always are among people of rank, calmly, almost kindly, as though it were simply the natural order of consequences, rather than a blade being pressed to the one thing Dorothea had married to protect. It was Sir Aldous, sensing how thoroughly she had been cornered, who offered her the easiest way out. He would leave England again, he told her gently, and never return, remove himself entirely, and with him, the only visible evidence the rumor required. But to do so would mean surrendering, forever, whatever proof he might one day have offered on her behalf, and Dorothea understood, standing in that quiet alcove with her sister's future balanced somewhere just out of reach, that an easy escape and a hard truth were not, in the end, the same kind of rescue at all. She did not yet know exactly what truth Sir Aldous was protecting, but she had learned by now not to trade away anything before she understood its worth. She went home that night in a carriage she shared with no one, and she sat with her back very straight and her hands folded in her lap, the way she had been taught to sit since she was 6 years old, and she did not allow herself to cry until the carriage had turned down the long drive at Ravensmere Hall, and there was no one left to see her do it. Even then, she allowed herself exactly as much grief as she could afford, and not one moment more, because she had a sister's future still to protect, and a set of ledgers waiting for her attention before dawn, and she had long ago learned that the world does not pause its demands simply because a heart has been badly bruised. You know that feeling, don't you, when you can sense a truth sitting just beneath the surface of a conversation, close enough to touch, and everyone around you keeps talking as though it isn't there at all. That is exactly where Dorothea stood that night, and it is exactly where the story is about to turn. The revelation came, in the end, not in a ballroom but in the quiet of the estate archive, 3 days after the scandal at Lady Fenwick's had finished making its slow, cruel circuit of London. Dorothea had gone there to hide, if she was honest with herself, though she would have told anyone who asked that she had gone to work. The archive held decades of Ravensmere correspondence and account books, shelved in a cool, dust-quiet room at the end of the east wing, where almost no one thought to look for the new Duchess. She sat at a small table with a single candle and a stack of ledgers, and she was still there, well past dark, when Sir Aldous found her. He did not sit. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her the way a man watches someone he has loved for years and is about to change forever, and then he crossed the room and set a folded packet of papers on the table in front of her. "I did not know," he said, "until you mentioned something your husband reads at night that he will not show you. I did not understand, until that moment, what I actually held." Inside the packet were letters, her own letters, the ones she had truly written to her father before the wedding, warm and honest, and entirely without the mercenary cruelty someone had invented in her name. Beside them lay a signed confession from a clerk, admitting that he had been paid by Mr. Edmund Vale to copy her hand and twist her words into something unrecognizable, and that the forged version had been delivered, unsigned, to the Duke of Ravensmere 3 weeks before his wedding. Dorothea sat very still. She did not gasp, and she did not weep, not yet. She simply held the true letters in one hand and the forged confession in the other, and felt something in her chest that she could not, at first, put a name to, because it was not only relief, it was grief for every silent, cold week that had never needed to happen at all. She read her own words back to herself, words she remembered writing, in her father's study, in the last calm days before his death, and she noticed, with a strange, distant clarity, how ordinary they were. She had written to her father about the weather at Ravensmere, in the letters that were forged, and about hoping her new husband might one day come to like her. There had never been anything in them worth hiding, and that, somehow, was the cruelest part of all. That a lie so much smaller and so much less interesting than the truth had been allowed to cost her 6 months of her own marriage. It was in that same instant that she heard him in the doorway. Jasper had followed her to the archive that night, meaning to demand, finally, an explanation about the man who kissed her hand at Lady Fenwick's ball, the visitor, the rumor, the silence he had let stand in that ballroom because some old, wounded part of him had wanted, badly, to believe the worst rather than risk hoping for the best. He had not meant to overhear anything. But he stood frozen in that doorway now, watching his wife hold in her 2 hands the entire architecture of everything he had believed about her, watching it come apart before his eyes, with no drama at all. Just a woman sitting quietly at a table, holding proof of her own innocence, and looking, for the first time since their wedding day, entirely undone. Neither of them spoke. Sir Aldous, with the tact of a man who understood exactly what he had just made possible, quietly withdrew, leaving husband and wife alone, with a silence that neither of them had chosen this time, a silence built entirely of shock. Dorothea rose from the table. She did not hand him the letters, not yet. She walked past him, out of the archive, down the long dark corridor, and out through a side door into the night, because some part of her needed air, needed movement, needed anything other than standing still in a room with a man whose face she could not yet bear to read. It had begun to rain, hard and sudden, the kind of summer storm that arrives without warning and soaks a person through in the time it takes to cross a courtyard. He followed her. He calls her name, and for the first time in 143 days, she turns to answer him, and what comes out is not forgiveness. The stable courtyard was empty at that hour, lit only by a single lantern someone had forgotten to bring in, its flame guttering against the rain. Dorothea stood in the middle of it, her gown already soaked through, her hair coming loose from its pins, and she turned to face her husband with an expression he had never once seen on her in 6 months of marriage, not composed, not careful, not folded neatly into whatever shape the moment required of her. "You forbade me to speak," she said, and the rain ran down her collar as she said it, and her voice did not shake even though her hands, at her sides, were trembling badly enough that she had to press them flat against her skirts to still them. So I learned to live inside my own silence. I built a whole life in the space you left me. I saved your accounts. I corrected 2 years of errors your steward never caught. And I never once asked for thanks, because you had made it clear thanks was not a thing I was permitted to be given. I kept your household running while you kept yourself locked away from me, as though I were something dangerous. I loved a man who never once asked what I felt, not on our wedding day, not in 6 months since, not even tonight, until the truth was placed directly in front of you, and you had no choice left but to see it. He said nothing. He stood in the rain with water running from his hair down the line of his jaw, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked like a man with no argument left to make. "And now you want the truth?" she said, and here her voice did finally catch, just once, before she steadied it again by sheer will. "The truth is, I was never disloyal a single day of this marriage. Not once. You simply never gave me the chance to prove it, because you never asked. You decided, before you ever met me properly, exactly what kind of woman I was, and then you built an entire silence around that decision so that I could never once show you otherwise. That is not a marriage, Jasper. That is a sentence, and I have served it faithfully for 143 days. She reached into the fold of her soaked gown and drew out the confession Sir Aldous had given her, the ink already smudging faintly at the edges from the rain, and she held it out to him, not gently, not as a gift, but simply as a fact that could no longer be denied. He took it from her with a hand that was not entirely steady. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain fell between them, loud against the cobblestones, loud against the lantern glass, and somewhere beyond the stable wall, a horse shifted in its stall and went quiet again. Jasper looked down at the folded paper in his hand, as though it might still, even now, prove to be a trick of the light, rather than a piece of solid fact he would have to carry for the rest of his life. "Dorothea," he said, and it was the first time in 143 days that he had said her name, and meant it as an apology rather than a formality. He did not finish the sentence. There was nothing yet that he could say that would not sound, even to his own ears, smaller than what she deserved to hear. She did not wait to watch him read it. She did not run to him, and she did not walk away in anger either. She simply turned, with the same quiet dignity she had carried since the day her father died, and left her nothing but debt and silence of his own, and walked back into the house alone, leaving the choice, for the first time in their marriage, entirely his to make. Jasper stood alone in the rain for a long time after she had gone. He unfolded the confession by the light of the guttering lantern and read it once, and then again, his own hands shaking now in a way he had not permitted them to shake in years, watching the ink begin to blur and run at the edges of the page, until the words themselves seemed to be dissolving in front of him. 3 years of certainty, of careful controlled coldness, of a wound he had nursed so faithfully, he had mistaken it for wisdom, and none of it, not one single week of it, had ever been true. He did not follow her into the house that night. It was not coldness that kept him in that courtyard, standing in the rain until the lantern finally guttered out entirely. It was the first honest reckoning he had allowed himself in years, the recognition, arriving far too late and far too completely, that the silence between them had never once been what he told himself it was. For the first time since their wedding day, the silence between them belonged to him. What followed, in the weeks after that storm, was not a scene of dramatic confrontation, but something slower and, in its way, far more costly to Jasper's pride. He summoned his own solicitor within days, and rather than simply confronting Edmund Vale privately, the quiet, contained solution that would have protected his own reputation, he called a formal hearing of family solicitors and several peers whose good opinion he had spent his whole adult life cultivating. He laid the forged letters on the table before them. He named his cousin as their author before witnesses, in a room full of men who had always known him as a duke, whose certainty was never questioned, and he watched that certainty cost him precisely as much standing as he had feared it would. It was, Dorothea would later understand, the truest apology he had ever offered her, not the private words he eventually found for her alone, though those mattered too, but the public staking of his own reputation on her innocence. in a world where private apology could never have repaired the harm his silence had done to her in full public view. Edmund Vale was stripped of his position as heir presumptive within the month, the diverted estate funds traced at last to accounts he had quietly maintained under a false name, and he left London society not in disgrace exactly, but in the particular quiet erasure reserved for men whose schemes have simply stopped working. Lady Fenwick, chastened by how thoroughly she had believed a rumor built on nothing, reinstated her support for Dorothea's sister's match without being asked twice, and became, in time, an unlikely and fiercely loyal ally to the Duchess she had once been so quick to condemn. If you've ever been the one holding your tongue to keep the peace, or the one too afraid to ask the question that might break something open, I want you to sit with this for just a moment before we finish, because I think a great many of us know exactly what that particular silence costs, even if we've never called it by its name. The weeks after that storm in the stable courtyard did not resolve themselves the way a fairy tale might have you believe. There was no morning where Jasper simply appeared transformed, no single speech that undid 6 months of silence in one clean stroke. He came to her the day after the rain, his eyes rimmed red from a night without sleep, and he did not ask for forgiveness so much as offer her the truth of himself, plainly, without defense. The letters, the years of believing his own mother's leaving, had taught him something true about every woman who might come after her, the way he had let a wound from boyhood stand guard over a marriage that had never once been given a fair chance to prove itself otherwise. Dorothea listened to all of it standing by the window of her own sitting room, her arms folded, her face giving away far less than her heart was doing underneath. She did not forgive him that morning, and she told him so plainly, because she had learned, by then, that dignity was not the same thing as coldness, and that a woman could still choose, in her own time, exactly how and when her trust would be rebuilt. He did not argue with her. That, more than anything he said, was what told her something in him had actually changed. It took the better part of that autumn. It took the public hearing, and the quiet, humiliating unraveling of Edmund Vale's schemes, and 100 small mornings after that, where Jasper simply appeared where she was, asked her opinion before he acted rather than after, and waited, patiently, without demanding anything of her in return, for her to decide, in her own time, that he had earned back the smallest measure of the trust his silence had once cost them both. Early spring came to the Ravensmere gardens the way it always does in Hampshire, slowly, and then all at once, the hedgerows going green almost overnight, after a long gray winter, the first narcissus pushing up through soil that had been frozen solid only weeks before. Dorothea was at the estate desk one morning, the same desk where she had once corrected 2 years of hidden errors in secret before dawn, no one the wiser. She was not hiding any longer. The household knew, now, exactly whose hand kept the accounts, and no one thought it strange, because Jasper himself had insisted upon it, publicly and without qualification, in front of the very steward whose mistakes she had spent so many quiet mornings correcting. He came in from the garden that morning, with mud still on his boots and a single early narcissus, snapped off carelessly at the stem, which he set down on the corner of her desk without comment, before he sat across from her, the way he had begun to do most mornings since the hearing. He picked up the ledger from the top of the stack and read the figures aloud in his low, even voice, while she checked them against her own careful notes, correcting him gently when he mistook a column, laughing once, quietly, when he pretended for her benefit that he had not mistaken it at all. It was not a grand reconciliation, and it was never going to be one. There had been no single perfect sentence that undid 6 months of silence, no scene that could be pointed to afterward, as the moment everything changed. It had been built instead the way most true things are built, in small daily gestures, in mornings like this one, in a silence that was, at last, chosen rather than commanded, and in the particular quiet comfort of 2 people who had finally learned to ask each other instead of assume. This was never really a story about a command to stay silent. It was about 2 people who mistook silence for safety, until the truth very nearly cost them everything they had left to lose. It was about a woman who refused to disappear inside someone else's fear, and a man who had to learn, the hard way, that the people we love cannot prove their loyalty to a silence we never let them break. If you've ever been the one holding your tongue to keep the peace, I hope you heard something in Dorothea's voice tonight that you needed. And if you've ever been the one who let your own fear speak louder than the person standing right in front of you, I hope Jasper gave you a little of that too. If this story kept you until the very last word, let me know the only way that matters to me. Subscribe, and stay for the next one. And if you don't, well, you already know you owe me a favor, and I intend to collect it one of these evenings. And somewhere in a quiet Hampshire garden, a duke who once forbade his wife to speak, now waits, every single morning, simply to hear what she has to say.